Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. They say that sometimes the most devastating earthquakes happen without warning. But that night, at our 25th wedding anniversary party, I felt the tremors long before the ground gave way beneath my feet. I had spent months planning every detail of that celebration. The chandeliers in our mansion's ballroom cast warm light across 200 guests. The finest wine flowed freely, and the string quartet played our wedding song just as Richard and I took the floor for our anniversary dance. At 50, I thought I had built something unshakable. My architectural firm had designed half the buildings in the city's skyline. Our home was featured in Architectural Digest, and our marriage seemed like the perfect capstone to a life well lived. But perfection, I learned that night, is often just an illusion we construct to hide the cracks underneath. The first crack appeared when I noticed Chloe, Richard's 25-year-old secretary, lingering by the champagne fountain. She wore a form-fitting emerald dress that accentuated what I assumed was simply an unfortunate food baby from the elaborate dinner we had served. Her hand kept drifting to her stomach in a gesture that seemed almost protective. When she caught me watching, she smiled with the kind of smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Richard had been distant for months, claiming work stress, late nights at the office, important client dinners that somehow never required my presence. I had rationalized it all away. After 25 years of marriage, passion ebbs and flows. We were both busy, successful people with demanding careers. The foundation was solid, even if the surface had grown a little cold. The second crack came when Richard tapped his champagne flute for attention. The room fell silent as he began his speech. His silver hair perfectly styled, he looked every inch the successful businessman, the devoted husband, the man who had everything. He started conventionally enough, thanking our guests, praising our enduring love, speaking of legacy and family. But then his tone shifted, became more pointed. He talked about disappointment, about unfulfilled dreams, about the ways marriage sometimes fails to deliver what we most desperately want. My stomach began to knot. Around us, guests shifted uncomfortably. My best friend Jessica caught my eye from across the room, her lawyer instincts clearly picking up on something dangerous in the air. Then, Richard did something that still haunts me. He gestured toward Chloe, his voice taking on a warmth that had been absent from our private conversations for years. The room became a vacuum. Sound disappeared. Time slowed. I watched his mouth move, heard words that seemed to come from very far away. He was announcing that Chloe was pregnant with his child, his son, the heir he had always wanted, the legacy that I, his barren wife, had failed to provide. The earthquake hit with full force. 25 years of marriage reduced to rubble in a single moment. The guests stared in horrified fascination as my husband publicly humiliated me in my own home, in front of everyone who mattered in our world. But instead of crumbling, something unexpected happened. I felt a strange calm wash over me, like the eye of a hurricane. I had spent 2.5 decades bending myself into shapes that would please Richard, sacrificing my own needs for the sake of our marriage, accepting less and less affection, attention, and respect, because I believed that was what commitment meant. I walked to the microphone, my emerald gown rustling against the marble floor I had personally selected when we built this house. The room held its collective breath. I looked out at the sea of faces, some pitying, some curious, some genuinely concerned. Then I looked at Richard, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw the weak chin hidden beneath his carefully groomed beard, the way his eyes wouldn't meet mine, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his nervousness despite his bold performance. I spoke quietly, but my voice carried in the sudden silence. I thanked our guests for coming. I acknowledged that they had witnessed something unexpected, something that would certainly be talked about for years to come. I suggested they might want to leave early, as the evening had taken an unfortunate turn. Then I looked directly at Chloe, who was now standing beside Richard with her hand protectively over her belly, and I smiled. Not the bitter, angry smile of a wronged woman, but something far more dangerous. The smile of someone who had just realized she held all the cards. I told her congratulations were in order. She was getting exactly what she wanted. A man who would betray his wife of 25 years in front of 200 people. A man whose business expenses I had been covering for the past 5 years because his own ventures consistently failed. A man who had been living in a house I owned, driving cars I paid for, wearing clothes purchased with money I earned. The guests began filing out quickly, some stopping to squeeze my shoulder or whisper words of support. Jessica remained, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, probably already mentally drafting legal documents. After the last guest left, I stood in my empty ballroom, surrounded by the detritus of what was supposed to be a celebration. Flower petals scattered across the floor, half-empty champagne glasses abandoned on tables, the sweet smell of wedding cake untouched on its silver stand. I walked to the wall safe hidden behind a Monet original and retrieved a manila folder I had hoped never to need. Inside were documents Marcus, my business partner, had brought me 3 months earlier, financial records showing Richard's embezzlement from our joint accounts, credit card statements revealing expensive gifts purchased for someone other than me, hotel receipts, restaurant bills for two when Richard claimed to be working late. I had known for months, had suspected for even longer, but I had chosen to hope, to believe, to give him the chance to come clean on his own. That chance had now definitively passed. The next morning, Richard woke up in the guest room to find the locks changed on our bedroom, his credit cards canceled, and a process server at the front door with divorce papers. I had spent the night in Jessica's kitchen, drinking coffee and planning my counterattack with the precision I usually reserved for my most complex architectural projects. We moved quickly. Within days, I had forensic accountants crawling through every financial record, private investigators documenting Richard's movements, corporate lawyers securing my control of the architectural firm that bore both our names but had always been my creation. Richard tried to fight back, of course. He hired expensive lawyers, claimed I was being vindictive, argued that he deserved half of everything we had built together. His mother hired a public relations firm to spin the story, painting me as a cold, career-obsessed wife who had driven her husband into the arms of another woman through neglect. But I had something they didn't expect: 25 years of careful record-keeping, documentation of every dollar I had earned and spent, proof that Richard's contribution to our wealth had been negligible for the past decade, evidence of his systematic financial betrayal that preceded his emotional and physical infidelity. The revelation that cut deepest came from Marcus, who had been watching Richard's behavior with growing concern. Richard had not just been embezzling from our personal accounts. He had been siphoning money from the business, using company funds to wine and dine Chloe, to rent an apartment for their liaisons, to purchase the jewelry she wore, and the clothes that flattered her young figure. Worse still, he had been planning to force me out of my own company. Documents found on his computer revealed discussions with potential investors who believed they were buying into a firm run by Richard Grant, not Laura Grant. He had been systematically taking credit for my work, my designs, my client relationships. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. Richard fought viciously, particularly over the house and the business. His lawyers painted me as calculating, claiming I had known about his affairs and had been building a case for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They weren't entirely wrong, though they misunderstood my motivations. I hadn't been plotting revenge. I had been protecting myself. During those months, I discovered muscles I didn't know I had. Not physical ones, but emotional and spiritual strength that had been dormant for decades. I learned to sleep alone without fear. I redesigned my living space to reflect my taste rather than accommodating Richard's preferences. I took on projects that excited me rather than ones that would generate the most income to support our lifestyle. The hardest part wasn't the public humiliation or the financial complexity. It was untangling 25 years of shared history, separating my identity from our couplehood, remembering who I had been before I became Richard's wife. I found old sketchbooks from my college years, filled with designs that were bold, experimental, nothing like the safe, profitable buildings I had been creating for the past decade. I called former classmates who had become artists and activists rather than pursuing financial success. I remembered dreams I had abandoned, not because they were impossible, but because they weren't practical for a woman trying to build a stable marriage with a man whose ambitions exceeded his abilities. Chloe gave birth to a son in the middle of the divorce proceedings. Richard sent photos, perhaps hoping to hurt me, perhaps genuinely believing I would want to see the child he had created with another woman. The baby looked like Richard's father, a weak-chinned man who had died penniless despite being born into wealth. I felt no maternal longing looking at those pictures. I felt something much more complex. Pity, perhaps, for a child who would grow up with Richard as a father figure. Sadness for Chloe, who was about to discover that Richard's charm was inversely proportional to the amount of responsibility he was asked to bear. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in October. I walked out of the courthouse with full ownership of my architectural firm, the house, and most of our investment portfolio. Richard left with his personal belongings, a modest settlement that would last perhaps 2 years if he was careful, and full responsibility for child support. Jessica took me to lunch at an expensive restaurant to celebrate, but I didn't feel celebratory. I felt empty, like a house after the movers have taken everything away. The walls were still standing, but the space echoed. I spent that winter in a kind of hibernation, working from home, taking only the projects that genuinely interested me. I read books I had been meaning to get to for years. I learned to cook for one person. I bought art I loved rather than pieces that would impress dinner guests. Spring brought unexpected renewal. A developer approached me about designing a community center in an underserved neighborhood. The budget was smaller than I was used to, but the project sparked something that had been dormant for too long. I spent weeks in that neighborhood, talking to residents about their needs, their dreams, their vision for their community. The building I designed was nothing like the glass and steel monuments to corporate success that had made my reputation. It was warm, inviting, built with local materials and designed to grow with the community's changing needs. When it was featured on the cover of Architectural Review, with a profile describing it as my best work, I realized I was finally designing buildings that mattered, rather than buildings that impressed. 2 years after the divorce, I ran into Chloe at the grocery store. She looked exhausted, pushing a stroller while juggling a diaper bag and trying to corral a toddler who was having a meltdown in the cereal aisle. She saw me before I could discreetly change direction. The conversation was awkward, but not hostile. She apologized, not for sleeping with my husband, but for the way the announcement had been handled. She admitted that Richard had been painting me as an absent, cold wife who had checked out of the marriage years earlier. She claimed she hadn't known about the embezzlement, hadn't realized how financially dependent on me Richard had been. I believed her. Mostly. She was young and had been manipulated by a man with decades more experience in deception. That didn't excuse her behavior, but it helped me understand it. She volunteered information I hadn't asked for. Richard was struggling to find work. His reputation in the business community had been damaged by the revelations that came out during our divorce. The child support payments were irregular. His mother, Eleanor, helped occasionally, but came with strings attached that made Chloe's life more difficult rather than easier. When we parted ways in the parking lot, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction at her obvious struggles, but a kind of compassionate detachment. Her life was her own to navigate. The choices she had made had consequences, just as mine did. 3 years post-divorce, I was offered a position as the head of the architecture department at the university where I had been teaching as a visiting lecturer. The job would require relocating to a smaller city, leaving behind the professional network I had spent decades building, starting over in a new academic environment. The old me would have consulted everyone, would have made lists of pros and cons, sought advice from Richard, worried about the financial implications, the social costs, the professional risks. The new me spent one weekend walking around the university town, visiting the campus, imagining myself in faculty meetings and design studios. I accepted the position without hesitation. As I prepare for this next chapter, I find myself thinking often about legacy, the word Richard had used so carelessly that night at our anniversary party. He had been obsessed with leaving behind something that would bear his name, extend his influence beyond his own lifespan. But legacy isn't about DNA or surnames or buildings with your name etched in granite. My legacy is in the community centers and affordable housing projects I've designed, structures that will serve families for generations. It's in the young architects I've mentored, who carry forward a vision of socially conscious design. It's in my own transformation, the proof that it's never too late to rebuild your life on a foundation of authenticity rather than compromise. But perhaps most importantly, my legacy is in the example I've set, however inadvertently, for other women who might be sacrificing too much of themselves for relationships that demand their diminishment. We don't change the world through grand gestures, but through the quiet courage of living authentically, of refusing to make ourselves smaller for others' comfort, of believing that we deserve relationships that celebrate rather than merely tolerate who we are. Tomorrow, I'll start packing for my move to the university town. I'll leave behind the house where I was humiliated. I'll take with me the lessons learned through pain, the wisdom earned through survival, the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed. At 60, I am finally the architect of my own existence, building something beautiful and functional and entirely my own. The blueprint is still evolving, but the foundation is solid now, constructed not on the shifting ground of others' approval, but on the bedrock of self-respect. And that, I have learned, is the only legacy that truly matters.